Thank you so much for being with us, Bilal.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege.
Thank you, at the Muslim House. So my first question is really about your journalism and your work, and sort of you've had a long career in journalism, and sort of how you see that trajectory shifting currently in the current environment.
I came to New York actually 20 years ago as a student at the Columbia Journalism School, and when I was here 20 years ago, we were still being taught how to write like leads for newspaper articles, and online media was called new media as a discipline. So I feel very much like someone who's watched, and grown up in this field as it's really shifted, especially I think in the last decade. And what I love, especially about someone say like Mira Nair, who's speaking here today, is that her work has sort of transcended time and has kind of felt like it's been a companion as I've watched lots of things change in terms of form, but I think it has been a reminder and a kind of North Star that like substance kind of has to sort of endure and has a kind of eternal quality to it. But I think all of us are realizing the language is changing, speed is changing. I came up in radio at NPR for 15 years or so, and we had to get guests into studios and have mics, and these kinds of things would have not existed then. And so I feel it's wild to feel like back in my day. I don't feel that old, but I do feel that these shifts have been incredible. And I think in a lot of ways the opening to so many new people is wonderful. I feel like when I entered there was a real gatekeepery quality, and it felt like one was the only one in the room in some of those newsrooms and organizations, and I think it's extraordinary what is happening. But I do think certain kind of like fundamentals of quality, elegance, eloquence, all those things are hopefully eternal, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that does. That does.
Well, I want to ask you about NPR and public radio in general. It is independent in many ways, but it's still linked to the establishment. And many listeners felt that, especially when it talked about Palestine or foreign policy in the Middle East, it towed the establishment line in many ways. So what's your
it's interesting
perspective now?
NPR moved its offices when I was working there from Gallery Place, which is downtown at DC, to right next to the Capitol on North Capitol Street. And so we could see the Capitol building from the newsroom, and from the windows. And I say that because I feel like NPR was part of the sort of like DC establishment in a lot of ways, and what I like to think of as the Northeast Corridor Amtrak media world. And I think that there's a lot of people in general who I think have lots of questions about establishment narratives, establishment biases. I'm not saying that to say that's true of NPR, but I do feel that it's part of a kind of ecosystem of maybe institutions and institutional ways of thinking. And I think we are in this really interesting time when institutions are being questioned and also being remade, and there are people who are toggling between or starting new institutions. And so I feel like that I think certainly foreign policy has always, and I started when like the Iraq War was happening in journalism, and I feel like there wasn't social media, but you knew people were feeling like, whether it was the New York Times, which had endorsed the war, or other places, I think that there had been questions that hadn't been able to be as public as now you can call out journalists. You could just post on their Instagram handle that this was biased or whatever. I think that kind of shift is why I think institutions do have to evolve and adapt. And I think in the past we could sort of just maybe feel like by being the establishment you didn't have the same kind of responsibility maybe.
Well, connected to that is, the First Amendment is not just about free speech, but it's about a free press.
Yeah.
And now you have people who are with government. They're usually the sources for a lot of stories, or they become journalists themselves, or they become, basically guests, columnists, and analysts on TV, especially. So where do you see the press these days? With this administration, it's obviously under attack.
It's funny. I think that there's
but in general,
there's the political bias question, but I would also say there's the business dimension to it too, right? I think there's a lot of. I would say I still really love public media and PBS and things, because I think while obviously it wasn't conventionally public, it had a different arrangement that people are aware of. But I would say that I felt like not being a commercial media, not having advertising be the driving force or metrics at the time that I came up was a real gift and a real privilege. I think now you have political bias, but you also have like metrics bias, right? And so it's like, what does it mean when you're creating journalism also in the age of like, getting eyeballs on it, making it, sexy, pop, hit the feed and hit it well. Like that's also a kind of bias, in my opinion, to be honest with you. And I say that as a person who did come up in public media, which maybe for better or for worse, was a little bit immune from that sort of like pressure. So I think there's political pressure for sure, and there's much to discuss in terms of like DC and especially the attack on the press that's been so public and vicious. But I would also say there's a different kind of thing going on where some of the commercial content also feels like it's really blurring the line of whether I would be able to call it journalism.
Well, on the
I don't know if I answered that question of your question.
Yeah,
but
you did.
Yeah.
No, it's good. On the issue of Palestine, I think things have changed. I remember, 30 years ago when we started the Impact DC office, you couldn't talk about Israel. You couldn't talk about Palestine.
Yeah.
It was basically the way to get excluded, to get canceled. Now, the tables have turned. How do you see the discussions about issues like being Muslim in America, Palestine, all these issues that used to be taboo, and I mean, not officially, but journalists just didn't want to go there because...
I mean, it's funny, 2006, when I was at J School in Columbia, I did my master's with Ahmad who was recently detained in Kuwait. He's a Palestinian American journalist, and what I remember is that we did our master's on Muslims in New York, and young Muslims 5 years after 9/11. And I feel like when I come to New York now, and it's, we know the city, who it's being led by, the cultural moment that it's having, the kind of diversity that feels like it's no longer just Muslims who are they're part of a much larger fabric of a city. And I feel that with the Palestine question, like there was always that onus that if you were the Arab in the newsroom or the Muslim in the newsroom, that it was your job to sort of like lead that conversation or feel like, what does that mean to me? I feel like now on that issue, it was actually led by a very wide coalition of young people. And I think the generational shifts are much more connected than they are my feeling of like starting out feeling like we're not represented, we're not seen, and the onus is on us. And now I think the onus seems a bit more collective, which is exciting, I think, from certainly 20 years ago. I keep sort of feeling like I'm having a midlife moment here, but that's, 20 years is a lot has happened, and I think this city is an incredible example of it.
I want to ask you about, thank you, Salam. I want to ask you about how our stories are being told in the media, and it feels like there's, just to that point, it feels like there's a big shift. You write a lot about, film and media and belonging, and it feels like there's more stories nowadays because of social media, but also in the mainstream print. Around, for example, Mira's films, around all of these young filmmakers who are trying to tell our stories in a more authentic, real way. We're not a monolith. We all come from different experiences, and so telling our stories used to feel like, from what I feel is, 20 years ago, was much more difficult, was much harder from the newsroom. How do you feel about where we're at today and how we're telling our stories?
I mean, I think what's exciting is that now it's very much a post-representation moment, and I think that it's almost like you can choose. Do you like sort of dramas? Do you like comedies? Do you like Deli Boys? Do you like Riz's Riz Ahmed's kind of films? I think that there's the great fortune is to have a wide genre of filmmaking and representation, so people can finally sort of maybe find what speaks to them, because we all are also a very diverse community in terms of taste and media sensibilities. And I mean, I'm a massive Mira Nair fan, but her films, again, may not be everyone's favorite film. So I think that the exciting thing is for creatives to also have that freedom, because I think one of the most important things in being an artist is to feel free. And if your genre is mystery, if your genre is romance, if it's I don't know, a sexy rom-com or whatever, like I feel like the exciting thing is that Muslims feel that there are more opportunities and more to say than just that they're here.
Yeah, we're no longer just the stereotypical terrorist where there's that one role of the brown person, and it's changing, and that's amazing. And so I love that the next generation feels like we're on billboards, we're telling different stories, we're playing different roles, we're writing different, and so I think that's amazing. But part of it is the role that you played in blazing that trail. I remember hearing your name on All Things Considered and remembering like, oh my God, that's amazing. There's, and so I think part of that is being one of those people who I know was not probably easy at telling those stories.
At that time, I think even an event like this, if it had occurred, I would have been so excited and so kind of feeling like you're seen and you're held and you're supported. And I think that is a really great opportunity for people now, making films, making journalism, making podcasts, whatever it might be. And the instruments have become so much easier to use.
More accessible.
So, exactly. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Great having you.
Thank you.